Hey everyone, and welcome to the final episode of the Neurodiversity podcast for 2023. The past year has been an exciting one for us, where we hit milestones related to the number of people that we're reaching through the podcast, and we launched our first community, the Neurodiversity University Educator Hub. 2024 has some amazing things in store too. We're expanding some of our course offerings, and we'll continue to build and grow the Educator Hub. Plus, my new book with co-author Amanda Morin on creating neurodiversity-affirming schools will be released in the fall. Thank you for being with us this year, and we look forward to continuing our conversation in the next. Understanding and supporting the emotional needs of our neurodivergent children is like learning a new language. When we think about Ross Greene's perspective that all behavior is communication, this analogy seems especially relevant. This Perspectives episode brings the insights from 3 of our guests together about how we can connect with our children and become fluent in interpreting those behaviors. Our first segment today features Dayna Abraham. Dayna is author of the book Calm the Chaos and host of the podcast by the same name. During this segment, she brings insight into how we can frame dysregulation and develop a plan to help. When we become parents, we have this imagined reality that parenting is kind of just all sunshine and rainbows. But as any of us can attest, parenting is so much harder than it looks and can be kind of heavy because it can lead to some of those negative emotions just about the parenting experience in general. And that can be really tough when you're feeling isolated as a parent, especially when society has all of its opinions. I just want to start off and ask you about how parents can shake off that pressure and that stigma when they're parenting neurodivergent kids.
That's a really good question. And I think, like you mentioned, all parents go through this of the shoulda, coulda, woulda, and all of the blame and the shame and the judgment that comes from society and other people and maybe even our parents. But when you're parenting a neurodivergent kid, I feel like it's 10 to 20 times the pressure and the push to do things like everyone else. And so I think helping parents remind themselves that you are exactly the parent your child needs, and you are the expert in your own child. And sure, you might not know everything there is to know about what your child needs or how to support them, and you're still learning those things. But there is no better person than you to do that job. And then the second thing is grounding themselves in the fact that they're not failing, that if things aren't going well, it just means that there's opportunities to learn, opportunities to tweak or shift, but it doesn't mean that they are failing. We are talking about real humans, and we're talking about raising humans that think differently, that act differently than what we've been taught or raised to believe parenting is going to be about. And so there's going to be bumps in the road, and just realizing, okay, I can do this. I am not alone. There's an entire podcast I'm listening to that's all about raising neurodivergent children. And so I know I'm not the only one doing this. And if we can ground ourselves in that, I think it makes it easier to handle what I call storms, but the bumps in the road.
Yeah. That feeling of universality, just knowing that we're not alone. Tell me about your path to finding some of that community. Was that something that happened automatically for you, or was it something that took time?
No, I think I'm still navigating that with each of my kids in the quote unquote real world. I think it's a lot harder for me to find those communities because, just as an example, my daughter doesn't have a specific diagnosis, but she's 10 years old. She struggles with anxiety. She has really strong sensory preferences. And so the traditional schooling is really hard for her because it's overwhelming, and she doesn't like to raise her hand. She doesn't like to ask for help. But she loves learning, and she loves the idea of school, and she loves friends. But there's so much about it that's really hard. And so it was really hard to get her to go to school. And we really just focused on supporting her and her needs. And so if that meant we went to school an hour late, if that meant that we missed school for a day, then I was okay with that because I would rather her be in a place where she can be receptive to learning, where she feels safe in her body, where she feels listened to and heard. And so the school, though, made me feel like I was the only one in the entire school who was struggling with this, and the only parent who couldn't get their kid to school. And I know from little side conversations here and there that that's just not the case, that there's far more kids who are struggling, far more kids who don't feel safe at school, who don't feel like they're being heard or their needs are being met at school. And we, the parents, are the ones left to blame. And that's me with the knowledge I have, the advocacy skills I have. And I think about the parents who don't have that privilege to have those things already in their toolkit and to have that ability to keep their kid at home. And they have to send their kids to school.
Yep.
And so I just want to acknowledge that even with my knowledge and with what I've gone through, I still struggle in the quote unquote real world to find those support systems. And so I find a lot of those support systems online. 10 years ago, when my son was really struggling, so he was kicked out of his first preschool, he was in trouble in kindergarten, and by second grade, he was kicked out of school more days than he was in school. He was having lots of aggressive meltdowns. He was eloping and leaving the school. He was doing all sorts of things. And the principal illegally told me that you can either let your son be taken into custody with this police officer, or you can take him home. Don't bring him back until you figure out what's wrong with him, quote unquote. And despite going through all the processes to get him an IEP and to get him the supports, he still wasn't being supported because they didn't quite know how to support a child who was neurodiverse like he is. And that was 10 years ago. And so when I came home to homeschool him, I started looking online and everything was picture perfect and do this and do that. And here's your reading room and here's your homeschool agenda. And everything looked so perfect that I felt like I was the only one that didn't know what I was doing. And here I was with 12 years of classroom education, knowledge, child development. I had all this knowledge, but yet I couldn't help my own son. And so I decided to start our blog. And the sole purpose was really selfish. I really just wanted to know there was one other person out there who was going through what I was going through. I didn't find one person. I found millions of people who are going through what I was going through. And now I've created an online community, and there are so many other communities out there. I saw just the other day that Walmart is having sensory days to do your shopping. 10 years ago, that would have been unheard of. And so the world is becoming more accepting, more understanding, more knowledgeable that we have all of these differences and these needs that our children have and that adults have. And so there is hope that there is community out there and there are others going through this.
I feel like that sense of community is so important because when you think about the connection between those societal expectations and also self-esteem, that emotional weight of falling short as a parent can really play into feelings of negativity. How do you feel like that whole feeling of maybe I'm not doing enough influences parents of neurodivergent kids? You mentioned it a little bit with your experience about trying to find that balance of what was right for your son, but how can parents have some resilience with some of that? How can they start on that journey?
Yeah, so I think it's really important, again, just to realize that this is really common of I'm not enough, I'm not doing enough, maybe I should be doing this, especially when you start to see people on social media, you see your friends, you see your cousins, all starting to have their kids meet different developmental milestones or different benchmarks. As parents of neurodivergent kids, we have to focus on those teeny tiny baby steps that we're making forward, not the 3 steps back and then the 1 step forward. But we have to look at that progress. We also have to really focus on our own mindset. And I know that sounds hokey pokey and all of that, but I think it's so important that we focus on our own perspective and our own thought shifts. And we use something, I talk about it in the book and we do it in our program, and it's called Thought Monsters and Super Swaps. And so depersonalizing these thoughts and ideas that we have. And I'm neurodivergent myself, so I can go on a worry loop like no one's business. And I can really go down that spiral. So having these thought monsters that I can pull out and say, oh, I noticed that cyclone is here, or I noticed that the always and never beast is happening, or, oh, I'm letting Judgy McJudgerson get to me. It takes it off of it being about me and it being shameful and it being something I'm judging myself again about. And instead I can say, oh, this is a common thought, a common belief, a common thing that happens. Now, who can I call on to help me?
My next conversation is with Linda Murphy. Linda is author of the book, The Declarative Language Handbook, which guides adults through using declarative language as a tool to help the dysregulation of the neurodivergent young people in our lives. I think if we had to find a collective characteristic that a lot of different neurodivergent people experience, it is that we communicate differently than what is considered the quote-unquote neurotypical norm. And I'm generalizing, of course, but I do think that we spend a lot of time focusing on how we can best shift communication for people. And declarative language is one way that we can shift our language. So can you tell us a little bit about what declarative language is?
Sure. When I do trainings, I find it's easier to first talk about what declarative language is not. So I'll start there. The opposite of declarative language is imperative language. And imperative language is just discrete language that places a very specific demand on an individual to do something, or for example, to say something. So examples might be put your shoes on, throw that away, stand up, sit down, that sort of thing. Say thank you. Those are all imperatives. Also, not declarative is question. So question asking is just, could be anything. What's your name? How is your day? So also not declarative. And what imperative and questions have in common is, as I said, they place demands on an individual to do something in the moment. So it might be to formulate language in the moment in the form of a response, or it might be a demand to do something. So declarative, we just flip that all on our head and we just comment, and we comment in the moment. So for example, put your shoes on as a declarative might be, I see your shoes over there, or I think it's a great idea to put on your shoes, or I think you need your shoes. So those are just comments in the moment that maybe guide a learner toward what they might need to do. So that, there's different ways or reasons that we might use declarative language that we'll probably get into. But also on its very basic level, declarative language is about experience sharing. So we're just commenting, like if you think about with a very young learner, you're just commenting on the immediate environment. So with a baby or a toddler, it might be, wow, look at the airplane in the sky, or I heard the dog barking too, or woof, that diaper really stinks. So it's just comments in the moment that don't place any demand at all. It's just communication for experience sharing and an invitation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's not even a requirement to reply.
Right.
It can just be very much about what's happening right here, right now in this present moment.
Right.
Sometimes we do these Ask Me Anything episodes, and in one of them I mentioned declarative language, and one of our listeners actually emailed and was perhaps both, I think, a little bit confused and also concerned, because she said she wasn't sure what that meant when I said it in the episode, and so she researched a bit more about declarative language. But to her, it sounded a lot like the passive-aggressive communication that she experienced in her family growing up, which I can totally see how it could be interpreted that way. So how is it different? How is declarative language different from that?
So on a mechanical level, passive-aggressive statements are also declarative statements. But the way that I write about it and the way that I want people to use is as a whole communicative package with positive intentions behind it. So when we communicate in a declarative way, and the way that I want to communicate with learners, and I'd like other people to do, is in this positive way that starts with a positive intention. And passive aggressiveness happens when your words spoken and your nonverbal communication do not align or there's a mismatch. So you might be saying something, but you're saying it with a sarcastic tone or a snarky tone. So all of a sudden it becomes a demand. So if you're using a declarative statement and there really is secretly a demand behind it or nonverbal communication that does not have that positive intention behind it, then the other person is going to perceive passive aggressiveness. So when I want to communicate with our learners, I want to have that whole presence in my nonverbal communication. So that's my tone of voice, my facial expressions, my gestures, my body position, all those pieces, and then add the declarative comment onto it. And that's the communicator I want to be. And that's the communicator that really supports our learners the most in the moment.
What are some reasons why this is beneficial? Like, what are the benefits to using this?
So what I always think about is a lot of our learners or individuals with social learning differences, they might experience anxiety around different things, certainly around demands in the moment that they may or may not feel that they can be competent in, or just they feel uncertain of. So anytime they feel a demand, it can create a stress response. Stress responses can create or lead to fight, flight, freeze behaviors, or what is seen as challenging behaviors on our end. So, but really it's just that stress response, that fight, flight, freeze, and it's an observable challenging behavior. And even just to get into that a little bit, like that could be yelling, it could be aggression. In the older learner, it could be sarcasm. It could be passive aggressiveness back. It could be, on a younger kid, it could be shutting down. Not just a younger kid, anybody, it could be shutting down. It could be climbing under a table, like who knows? But what declarative language does. So as we said before, imperatives and question asking create a demand, which can result in a stress response. When we use declarative communication in this way, we are not placing a demand, and therefore we're much less likely to trigger that stress response. And therefore our learner is better able or can just stay engaged for longer periods of time because they feel safe. We're not placing any demands or pressure on them that they feel worried or anxious about.
When I first started working as a teacher and as a counselor and was working with parents specifically, and this was before I had my own kids, I look back now and I'm like, why did those parents listen to me? Because I think having been a parent, it kind of shifts some of those things, and like that lived experience is very different. And so I'm curious, have you used this with your own kids, and has it influenced how you interact with them, like being aware of this and thinking about it?
Absolutely. I use it with my kids. We're all human, so we're all imperative and question asking at times. But when I'm at my best, I'm declarative. And it just, I like to think it really makes our connection with each other stronger. They're open to things that I say because I'm not going to place a demand on them really quickly. On the foundation level, it strengthens our relationship. And when you have a strong relationship, the sky's the limit, but that's the foundation. It's not just about the tricks or what words you say. It's really about establishing that strong foundational relationship that can handle the ups and downs of life. So declarative language really helps create that. But then with my kids, I see them assume responsibility for problem solving, sometimes take initiative with helping out or different tasks, like not always, of course, but I just feel like it keeps our connection positive, and that's what I like about it the most. Like I don't feel like I'm always nagging them. Like sometimes I probably feel like I am, but I also know I can walk away and try again, give a space, come back around.
We'll wrap up this Perspectives episode with the incomparable Dr. Mona Delahooke. Mona is a psychologist and author of the book Brain-Body Parenting. Her insights on how to understand and support emotional regulation in young people are changing lives.
I think there's kind of this mystical and kind of unspoken idea that behavior management is appropriate and somehow valued. But then if you look at the history a very interesting history of the behavioral sciences, right? When behaviors started to be studied, Pavlov studied in Russia, and then those studies came to the US at Harvard. And, you've heard of B.F. Skinner and the Skinner box and all sorts of, actually, frankly, they were interesting animal studies if you were looking at animal behaviors. And yeah, sure enough, they found that humans can work on reinforcement schedules too, to a certain extent. People were so enamored of that science, and it was brought over to the University of Washington and then to UCLA by Ivar Lovaas, who was again, they were studying humans. And at that point, autism was so poorly understood, but the idea that, they tried to help children with self-harm and different severely challenging behaviors using behavioral methods, somehow with how the research was interpreted as successful, it became the mainstay of our education system. And behavioral management, or the science of applied behavioral analysis, has turned into a billion-dollar business. It's a very big business. And this is a no blame, no shame zone. I do not believe that teachers and aides and behavioral technicians are not well-intentioned and don't want to help our kids. So let me just say that right there. However, what I do think is that because it is such a big business and it does have a lot of power and a lot of ability to lobby for their businesses, that when you look at the science, the neuroscience of resilience, and you lay that side by side to behavioral management, the two don't line up very well. And that's why I started blogging, and that's what ended up in my book, Beyond Behaviors, with many, many stories of children whose behaviors were manipulated and they suffered from additional problems like low self-esteem, even sometimes anxiety and traumatic reactions, because their bodies were prevented from moving in ways that were helping them survive and thrive. And their behavioral teams were encouraging them to go against what their body needed to do in favor of being either compliant or looking neurotypical. And so enter the neurodiversity movement. We have a lot of adults who tell you, and these are my heroes. These are the people that I take my information from. Those individuals who went through their programs and are coming out and talking about it and have the courage to do that and say, this was wrong. This is not okay. I think you've interviewed Jonathan Mooney, and he says folks with neurodiversity have value not in spite of their differences, but because of their differences. And I completely agree with this. I've seen it in real life. And those individuals, those children, those teenagers and adults, they have brilliant contributions to make. And it breaks my heart when we give children the message early on, because I'm an early intervention specialist, that somehow they need to change the way they're acting.
Yeah.
That's a problem to me. That's a problem. Many parents don't even know that there's a difference between top-down and body or bottom-up behaviors. So what's the difference? One of the first questions I ask is this behavior top-down or body-up? Because the way we respond to it is going to make a big difference. A top-down behavior is a behavior where the child is planning it out, is mediated or intentional, as we might say. So this is guided by a thought. What would an example be? A child's tucked in bed and they're all cozy. They know their parents are asleep, but they think, I'm hungry. I'm going to go sneak down to the kitchen and get that big slice of chocolate cake and eat it, and the parent comes down. If the parent hears some rustling in the kitchen, they're like, hey, are you hungry? Okay, that's a top-down behavior. The child had the thought. They were maybe testing the boundaries a little bit. I think it's quite creative, actually. I would have been one of those kids. But that's top-down behavior, okay? And parents can, of course, deal with that in the way they see fit. Let's contrast that to a bottom-up behavior. Let's say a child is watching TV, we're watching the Olympics, and they are beginning to fatigue, but they don't know that. And they start asking the parent for that chocolate cake. And the parent says, no, sweetie, we've already had dinner, and I can get you some sliced apple or something. And then all of a sudden, like kind of on a dime, the child throws the remote for the TV, is red-faced, crying, screaming, sweaty. The features on that behavior, how fast it happened, how automatic it seemed, the red flushed face, the irregular heartbeat, all of those are signs of a body-up behavior. When the child's nervous system shifted onto a pathway away from the social, what we call the social engagement pathway, or the green, I just call it like the green pathway, the green light to interact, turned into this red explosion. And that is actually a sign, like a stop sign, like just stop as a parent, stop and observe what's going on. Okay, this is body up. They got up early this morning. It's an hour past bedtime. Okay, things are pretty thin with the child. They weren't able to manage the emotion around not getting a piece of cake. That would be an example of a child who doesn't need discipline. Of course, you keep them safe and make sure that they know that it's not okay to throw a remote, but you just don't go on a big, long discourse of reading them a bunch of rules. You just realize, we need to help this body right now. I think it's time to prepare to go to bed as quickly as possible. You say to yourself, and then you know that the body is in charge. Their nervous system is at a place where it's not able to self-regulate very well. So this whole distinction of figuring out, is this bottom up? Is this top down? Can really help guide us as parents as to what we do in difficult parenting moments.
What are our next steps?
Yeah. And our first step should be checking in with ourselves and seeing if we are like sometimes,
Yes.
When your child does something like that, it automatically triggers us into that body up reaction. And again, completely expected. We all lose it as parents every now and then, right? But we do want to, through our power of self-observation, make sure that if we are in that body up, out of control phase, that we pause if we can, take a moment, don't react from that space, because that's when our kind of unfortunate parenting moments can happen. And we may do or say things that we really don't intend.
Yeah. In our house, we have a lot of neurodivergence. It becomes a little chaotic at times between the five of us. And I know for me, you mentioned like that situation, like kind of happening in the evenings. And for me, that is definitely when I'm at my least flexible and my least resilient on my own. And so I kind of have to I try to be really aware of that and very cautious, which is helpful, but it doesn't help me from feeling guilty afterwards if I don't have it, if I'm not able to do it. It's hard.
It's since our kids are our biggest responsibility and so much is at stake, right? It's easy to be hard on ourselves, but I think it's also so important to realize that how much of an empty cup are we trying to pour from? And you can't, as that old saying goes, you really can't pour from an empty cup. So that brings it right back to what you said. It's just this awareness. If you realize you're getting thin at the end of the day, it's like, okay, I'm going to take it a little slower here. I'm going to be a little more gentle on myself. And sure enough, it can, and it does flow down to our children in a parallel process.
One of the things that I've been actually reflecting on quite a bit recently and kind of trying to just seeing it in different situations and trying to figure out like what the best way is to support some of my clients or different people, is the connection between sensory awareness and emotions and behaviors. And I find it really fascinating. And I know that many neurodivergent people just have significant sensory processing differences, whatever that might be. And that might impact, for example, their interoceptive sensory awareness. So for our listeners who might not be familiar with that term, that means interoception is the awareness of the sensations that occur within our body, like differentiating between a feeling that might mean that I'm hungry, that I need to go to the bathroom, or maybe I'm feeling anxious, or a variety of other things that similar sensation might indicate. And so that ties in to this concept of alexithymia, which refers to someone who has a difficult time identifying emotions and the variations within those emotions. So I'm curious about how you conceptualize that and how you might support people, kids, whoever, who might be experiencing the intersection of those influences.
You've just brought up such a hot topic in neuroscience and in, I think, maybe beginning in the clinical world as well. And it's this whole idea of the role of what you said, interoception, in our physiological functioning, in our emotional functioning, in our ability to be aware of an internal sensation, which is called interoceptive awareness. So interoception is a subconscious process. So it happens all the time. That feedback is going from in and around our internal organs and the deep insides of our bodies up to the brain. And wow, the research around this is so complex, and it is way beyond my level of expertise as a clinician, but I am a voracious reader about interoception. And I'm in a really amazing study group with some of the leaders who are clinicians as we translate the neuroscience and what it means for our children, for our parenting, for ourselves. This concept of interoception is, in my opinion, is going to change the way we view the creation of emotions.
I agree.
And also help inform this whole idea of alexithymia, literally, which means without words for feelings, which many individuals experience. Like, it's not easy to say, oh, I feel exuberant, or I feel terrified, or I feel like I have butterflies in my stomach. Those statements are incredibly, incredibly complex. They come out of a whole cascade of processes. It's just an area that is super emerging, but extremely important. If your listeners aren't aware of the work of Kelly Mahler, she has written a book about interoception, and she has a Facebook group around interoception. I can't remember the exact name of the group, but it's Kelly Mahler, Mahler. And she is an occupational therapist who is translating for parents and caregivers of neurodivergent kids. She works with in early intervention and works with children with brain wiring differences in their families, helping develop interoceptive awareness. So why is this important? It's believed that our basic feelings inside of our body arise from sensations. And the lab of Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett is looking strongly at how emotions are constructed. And so the framework around that has to do with sensations at kind of ground zero, which then informs the body as to what's called affects, basic affects. But we can think of basic affect as feeling good or bad, yucky, like on a valence of I feel really crummy to I feel good. It's kind of a very vague notion of I'm okay or feeling okay or I'm not feeling okay. So that range of pleasant to unpleasant, like if you ask a person, is this sensation in your body right now, is it pleasant or unpleasant? Some individuals can't locate that, right? So we can start there. Just trying to locate, is this generally pleasant or unpleasant? And is the level in terms of calmness versus agitation? Are you feeling generally more calm or are you activated? Is this urge to move? Are you really not feeling good? We can look at these basic what they're called valences, but pleasant or unpleasant, calm to agitated. We can start there with our kids and with ourselves, and then grow awareness of thinking about, rather than asking someone how you're feeling, because that's a very sophisticated question, we might shift it to, are you feeling anything in your body? Where are you feeling something? And it could be anything. So where, instead of asking, how are you feeling? You say, where? Is it tummy? Is it toe? Is it head? Is it heart? Let's see possibly if an individual can locate where they're feeling something. That's super powerful. That's the beginning of interoceptive awareness, is becoming aware of physiological, meaning body sensations. And some believe it's the birthplace of emotional literacy, because basic sensations later on may be experienced as emotions. If that sounds technical, I'm sorry. The research is so interesting, but I think it just tells us as parents that we can really start to pay attention to our own internal sensations and then help our children to do the same. That's a very powerful precursor of helping them later on to be better aware of their emotions, if they can.
Helping kids and teens develop the skills of regulation takes time, and we can work alongside young people as they develop these skills. If you would like to hear the full episodes from any of the people you heard here, check out the link in the show notes. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next year on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Okay, so I do some lurking on various social media platforms, and I was checking out a conversation about word association, and the subject was 2023. And the words people came up with to describe the year were, on one hand, a little concerning, especially compared to responses, say, a decade ago, but on the other hand, it was almost exactly what I expected. Of course, it's all really subjective, but generally, we seem to have a pretty bad feeling about what's going on currently. So I guess I hold out hope that a year from now we're choosing better words to describe 2024. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our office manager and social media director is Krista Brown. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thank you for listening. Happy New Year, and we'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.